Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And thank you to our speakers and moderator whom I think will be introduced a bit later. Tonight, really, I'm speaking because I have the honor of saying a few words about Andrew Levitt, who retired just over a month ago now, and to whom we're dedicating this two-year lecture series entitled Praxes of Care. So what will 5 minutes allow me to say about Professor Emeritus Andrew Levitt? I can say that Andrew, interested in the unseen side of things, went on to study psychology and work as a psychotherapist after completing his studies in architecture at the Architectural Association in London, UK. I can say that he returned to teach architecture, thankfully for us, seeing that, as he writes, and I quote, he could teach design as a process of enriching both the designer and the world. I could also say that he published 2 books, The Inner Studio in 2006 and Listening to Design in 2018. But I could never really tell you about Andrew by simply listing his accomplishments, because Andrew is so much more committed to the how than he would ever be to the what, but also because someone like Andrew, who recognizes the potential of gaps, the richness of shadows, the importance of moments of pause, the presence of what is not visible, and the weight of what lies in darkness. A legacy slowly and quietly evidenced through decades of teachings in the school is not about what lies on the surface, but about really profound commitment. And it's as much about what he did as it is about what he did not do. So for example, Andrew would never make a show of what he knows, but his knowledge has deep ramification. And he shares in his writings and teachings a great understanding of the care required to build a world that includes a more compassionate relationship, not only with the unwanted aspects of the self, as he puts it in the Inner Studio, but also we could add a more compassionate relationship with the repressed in history and in our societies. I love his description of the meaning of understanding, which he says it's understanding. So seeing, and I'm quoting again, seeing something from below, from a more humble, less power-centered vantage point, where one's previously held positions and opinions are less involved in the act of perception. So when a group of students, staff, and teaching faculty organizing the lecture series decided to focus on care, they realized that much of this work on and about care was Andrew's work all along. To honor this legacy, it only felt appropriate to dedicate the lecture series to Andrew. Before he retired, Andrew shared with me his willingness and also his desire to be back here for our last lecture. And we are certainly planning to hold one event that will be centered on his teachings. The truth, though, is that Andrew is now in really poor health, so much so that the last lecture, as he had attended it, cannot be. There will be an event, and Andrew's teachings will be central to it, even if it is through books that he has already written, lectures he has already been thinking about, or through conversations with people he has so meaningfully mentored and guided. And more on this event will come at a later time. So today, the dedication of the lecture series is simply a way to clearly and gratefully acknowledge Andrew's long-standing preoccupation with care, honoring what I am now thinking of as a form of prescience that he has, an ability to see right through the things that must be done, but also how they must be done, so slowly, carefully, respectfully, silently, humbly, yet with full and relentless dedication. On September 30th, I was stunned with that same realization of what perhaps is most accurately described as a presence than a prescience, a very involved presence that Andrew always adopts. Andrew has a way of being fully present, listening actively and caring deeply. So on September 30th, on the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, Elder Loenogwa's Bill Woodworth hosted a ceremony by the Grand River here, just outside the School of Architecture. And I'm speaking from the school today, and it's important to acknowledge that the school is located on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. We are located on the Haldeman Track, land promised to 6 nations that sits 6 miles on either side, or 6 miles or 10 kilometers on either sides of the Grand River. As he stood by the Grand River and conducted his ceremony, Bill Woodworth wanted to read a quote from a text Andrew had written and shared with him a few years ago now. The title of that text is Open-Hearted, Healing-Minded. In this text, which Andrew had shared personally with Bill, Andrew referred to the harm and tremendous trauma of the residential schools. He discussed the need for the nation to acknowledge and look into this dark past that persists in our present. When acknowledging the land and our relation to the past and present for the future, I hope we can be guided by Andrew's call to be open-hearted and healing-minded. And as I think of Andrew, of the how of his mode of being, I think of this way of seeing farther ahead, to his quiet commitment to effecting long-lasting and meaningful transformations. I will leave this very short introduction as this, leaving so much of this legacy for now untold. And again, I'm thankful for the opportunity to honor one of the most empathetic listeners, teachers, and colleagues I've had the chance to work with. Someone who's helped colleagues and students open up their own paths and become determined listeners and caring designers. And before I give the microphone back to Brenda, I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the group that worked passionately to coordinate the lecture series: Tara Bissett, Adrian Blackwell, Julie Dring, Jaliya Fonseka, Marie-Paule Macdonald, Mayuri Paranthahan, Brenda Reid, Beth Vince, Wendy Yuan, and Joel Yuan. So thank you for the committee for gathering such a range of outstanding speakers around Praxes of Care, and for this opportunity to honor the legacy Andrew has been building over decades of thoughtful work at the school. And now back to Brenda for more introductions.
Thank you, Anne. Before we begin tonight's talks, I'm going to share a few thoughts on our lecture series, Praxes of Care. Care is a truly complex topic. It is situationally based, often involves multiple people, and comes with inherent power imbalances. It is both a current and ancient issue. It is fundamentally part of us, and yet can be painful and burdensome. The COVID-19 pandemic has resurfaced conversations of care into both public and professional circles. We've seen care be commercialized, charged, and weaponized in both our current circumstances and historically. I think it's also important to note that any ideology of care resides within a particular society and is therefore both inseparable and shaped by that society. The lecture series, Praxes of Care, looks at both theory and practice together. We are using the words attention, action, communication, and maintenance as containers to discuss different aspects of care practice. Each of these terms is a theme for a semester of talks, thus providing multiple viewpoints, interpretations, and practices for discussion on each word. These words are carefully chosen to relate to both architectural practice as well as current care theory. Tonight, we begin our series with the word attention. What is observed, focused on, or paid attention to is filtered through our individual experiences and understandings of the world. In bringing attention to something, other things may be neglected in the process. What we pay attention to affects and reflects our worldviews and decisions we will make. We ask, how can we be attentive to care needs while remaining also critical of how attention is given and to whom? I now have the honor of introducing tonight's moderator, Mkomose Dr. Andrew Judge. Dr. Andrew Judge is Assistant Professor of Anishinaabe Studies at Algoma University and Xinhua Kinemagamik, and has lectured at Sir Wilfrid Laurier University, the University of Waterloo, and coordinated Indigenous Studies at Conestoga College. He specializes in Anishinaabe cultural knowledge, ethnomedicine, and land-based learning. Mkomose has learned from, worked, consulted with, and served Indigenous elders and community leaders for over a decade. He has founded several community-led Indigenous knowledge-based programs at elementary, secondary, and post-secondary levels, and works tirelessly to promote land-based sustainability practices. Dr. Andrew Judge has delivered over 100 invited lectures related to Indigenous knowledge with a pointed focus on Anishinaabe teachings. He constantly supports conscious awakening using plant medicines and an Anishinaabe cosmovision to respond to the current state of society. He has been initiated into both Medeawin and Mayan day-keeping societies and regularly participates in the ancient ceremonial practices of his Anishinaabe ancestors. Over to you, Dr. Andrew Judge.
Which Nindawe Mogini Dug. I'm related to everything. Mkomose and the go. The spirit calls me Bear Walker, Mashika and Odam. I am Turtle Clan. Deshkanzi Bing and Dunjaba. I was born and raised along the Horn of the Serpent River, present day London, Ontario. Currently residing in Bawating or Sault Ste. Marie. Anishinaabe Ojibwe and Indian Dao. I am an Anishinaabe Ojibwe man, and I am also Irish and Nui Shaganashi. I'll speak English. Thank you for the words that have been shared so far, Dr. Waterloo and Brenda. Thank you so much. And I have the distinct honor of introducing our two speakers today, Brian Porter and Tiffany Shaw. I did some background checks on you both. And I was just super impressed with your resumes and the work that you both accomplished. I think I'll start by introducing Tiffany. I can't remember the order of the speakers. Is it Brian and then Tiffany, or Tiffany and then Brian, or does it matter? Tiffany first? Brian first. Okay. So, but I'll start. I'll introduce you both. And I just want to thank you both for your time and joining us today. I've been really privileged to teach at the School of Architecture and have experienced, some of whom are here, some of the brightest students that I've come across in a decades-long career. So I'm super thankful for that. And without further ado, I'll start with Tiffany. So Tiffany Shaw-Collinge, is that right? Collinge or close?
That was great. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Is an interdisciplinary artist, curator, and registered architect based in Alberta. She holds a BFA from Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, a master's in architecture from the Southern California Institute of Architecture. Tiffany is a core member of the Osisiwan, is that right?
Otitsuwan.
Otitsuwan, thank you. Contemporary art collective, and is currently working at Reimagine Architects. Oscillating between digital and analog methodologies, Tiffany's work gathers notions of craft, memory, and atmosphere. Her practice is often guided by communal interventions as a way to engage a lifted understanding of place. While born in Calgary and raised in Edmonton, Tiffany's Métis lineage derives from Fort McMurray via Fort McKay and the Red River. And that's quite a history there. That you are connected to, quite an ancestral lineage. I think we're all honored by your presence here and the work that you've accomplished. I was amazed at some of the work that I saw on your website. So incredible to see the forms and how you've imagined them within spaces. Thank you for that work. And Brian, Brian hails from Six Nations of the Grand River. He has been a business leader for many years, designing and overseeing the construction of projects for First Nations communities across Canada and the United States. He has demonstrated success in designing culturally appropriate projects for these communities and has worked to maximize the participation of First Nations skills and trades. Two-Row Architect promotes Indigenous values in design by embedding traditional knowledge into buildings using current building technology, while actively promoting the creative, environmentally conscious use of building materials. And Brian, thank you. There's quite a history of where you reside from too. Six Nations, where I've worked and had ceremony and learned from some incredible people in that area. Also, I was pretty amazed to see that you actually worked and designed Xinhua Kikinamak Egamik. What an incredible achievement it's such a beautiful building sitting right on the St. Mary's River, where I have an office. And we just built a teaching lodge outside there. So you'd be happy to know that we are actively using that space and are inspired by the form that is on that land. So miigwech to both of you for your time, for your energy today. And I certainly can't wait to hear what you have to share. So I believe, Brian, you will lead us off.
Thanks, Andrew, for that gracious introduction. I put together, about 10 or 15 minutes of a couple of things that I want to talk about. I really much prefer conversations to presentations, so I'm really looking forward to the moderated piece that will follow this. And then kind of thinking about Praxes of Care. I was struggling a little bit to put a title to this presentation, and after scratching my head for a little bit, I kind of arrived at this idea about natural carrying capacity. And every time we sort of approach a development site, we kind of try to take a look at it and think about more than just human occupancy, which really tends to be a lot of the priority with the development community, and trying to think about, how we have a responsibility, excuse me, to kind of share resources, and to think about, what has a right to be on that piece of land every bit as much as we do. Whether it's plants, animals, rainfall, wind. I'm not sure when rain got engineered a few years ago, right, into stormwater management, and I'm not sure it's something that was at one time a gift has now become kind of thought of in a lot of the development industry as a bit of a liability, right? It's something to be feared, and so to begin, I just wanted to with the overview. So I wanted to talk about a couple of projects that I really draw a lot of inspiration from, and that's Machu Picchu near Cusco in South America, and I also wanted to talk about Mesa Verde a little bit, and then I wanted to spend the bulk of my time talking about a case study, a project that we're working on that's it's kind of in its conceptual design stage, but I think the three projects kind of do a good job of kind of summarizing a lot of our philosophy in the office and a lot of the viewpoint that we're trying to bring to some of our recent work. So next slide, please. So that Machu Picchu, it's Incan in the country of Peru. Most of you are aware of it. Built in the 15th century, lie dormant for a few centuries when it was rediscovered in 1911. And what I really appreciate most about this place is how certain sort of aspects of living are also tightly woven together, that the kind of the connections between spaces that are intended for residential use or agricultural use or recreational, civic, or cultural uses, the lines between them become so blurred that they're really indistinguishable. And it's always kind of interesting to me that some of our current zoning bylaws almost pull apart sort of like the very fabric of what makes communities, right? Like if you take a look at some of the master planning for towns like Waterloo and others, you have industrial zones, you have residential zones, you have commercial zones. So the regulatory framework almost by definition pulls apart community. And next slide, please. But in a place like Machu Picchu, I still believe that it's unparalleled. It's still it's unparalleled by any modern architecture that I'm aware of. In terms of creating this community, which is really a response to its natural environment. It's a response to its ecosystems, and I have a real appreciation for the skillfulness that was demonstrated, the way that this place was built, the way the stones fit, the level of craftsmanship that still kind of is, exudes to this day. And it really is kind of humbling for me to kind of to take a look at this. I did a pilgrimage. I was there in 1989. I spent a couple of days on site there, and just a very, really humbling kind of experience. Next slide, please. Here's a bit of a plan, and again, you see all of these these uses are really tightly woven together, and this project is really, really about its unique location, its unique orientation, the way that the architecture kind of grew out of the landforms that were there. Next slide, please. And just stunning to walk around this place. You don't really have to squint your eyes much at all to really understand what it would have been like to live there, to walk the streets, to feel the streetscapes, to understand how the rainwater got collected and channeled. So it sets the bar pretty high for me. And as I was saying, I can't think of any other construction in the last 100 or 200 years that's even come close to the richness and the diversity that's still readily apparent in this project that was constructed a few centuries ago. Next, please. The other one that I wanted to talk to a little bit was about Mesa Verde. Again, inhabited approximately from about 600 AD to 1300 AD. And what strikes me about this development is the way that it accepts Mother Earth's gifts, the way that it's oriented. Next slide, please. So there's a real strong connection between directionality with basically the face of this community, facing due south to receive sunlight, the way that it's tucked under the brow of this side of this canyon wall, so that when the sun is high in the summer sky, the brow of the rock protects the building with keeps it in shadow, and then when the sun drops in the winter time, it really opens itself out, and a lot of thermal mass really takes advantage of its directionality. Next slide, please. But there's also this plan that for me is really about a diagram of living, right, where you've got the individual cells that would comprise individual residences, but these interspersed with these are these gathering places that really kind of speak to community. I think they speak to a lack of hierarchy. And again, I can't I can't think of a modern day development that's got a settlement pattern that's kind of as rich as this and makes such a commitment to community and sharing, and really just kind of like setting up this organization for living, very, very even-handed, very, very organic, and also, again, like Machu Picchu, very much a product of its place. Next, please. And just a very, very sort of inspired, poetic view of what this place is like. I haven't been there. It's definitely on my bucket list. I understand now that reservations, need to be made, and tours need to be arranged. But I hope to get there one day. Next, please. And I'm gonna talk now about a project that we're currently working on, and that it's inspired by those two historic precedents. I don't think it gets anywhere near to be as successful as they are, but it does kind of demonstrate how we're trying to sort of look backwards, how we're trying to incorporate current technology into our contemporary work, and how we're trying to infuse Indigenous values, and, as kind of a higher form of life than Indigenous representation. Like, I'm still seeing a lot of work out there where indigeneity is represented in two-dimensional form. Oftentimes it's surface applied. It's only skin deep, whether it's sculptures or artwork. What we're trying to do in our work is look backwards, learn from the past, identify what characteristics and what values are important, and really sort of just working as hard as we can to incorporate as many of those kinds of ideas into our work as we can. And when we think about development, we also, we look back at traditional governance, which where I come from, it's matriarchal. The women are the ultimate decision makers, and unlike a corporate architecture that tends to be, male dominated, we're still seeing probably in the city of Toronto, 95% of what's getting built is corporate driven. It's very iconic, male dominated. So I think an Indigenous architecture is more about a matriarchal society. It's about consensus building. It's about trying to arrive at plans that are very sort of non-hierarchical, and where there's an element of participation with the clients in the identification of options, the selection of preferred options, and then the fine tuning of the preferred option to get to the point where we all decide what gets built. So we're just asking the question, can these qualities be balanced with contemporary need? So this is kind of what we're striving for. So the case study that I want to show just briefly, I don't want to spend too much time with this, but it's for, and we're calling it an Indigenous hub. And the Indigenous hub, if you want to think about a chair that has 4 legs, one of the legs is Nawasa, which is child care and family services. That's one of the legs. So there's going to be a child care piece and a family resource piece that people from the community can visit. There's a fairly large housing component that's being led by Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services, who are headquartered in Sault Ste. Marie. They're looking at doing some affordable housing on the site. One of the other cornerstone groups is the Dwada Desni. They're an Aboriginal health access center that provide services to off-reserve Indigenous people that would be living in the Brantford, Hamilton, Niagara region. They're doing primary care, but also a lot of counseling and outreach services, nutrition studies as well. So they're one of the main drivers. And then lastly, McMaster Family Health Center is looking for a place to deliver some primary care services in the segment of Hamilton that we're located that's underserved at the moment. So these are really fun projects. You think about these different partners coming together, and it's been fun to work with them to try to arrive at a design that's equitable and that it incorporates some of the values and principles that they hold kind of dear to their hearts. Next slide, please. So this is a shot of Hamilton, the greater Hamilton area. You can kind of see the Skyway in the top middle, that green band that kind of crisscrosses across the middle of the slide. That's the Niagara Escarpment. We're right near the Red Hill Creek Expressway. That's sort of that umbilical cord that kind of runs through the middle. And then you can see the red flag there, which is kind of near the corner of Barton Street and the Red Hill. It's right near that intersection. So I mean, Hamilton's been going crazy lately with gentrification, and a lot of the community are being driven away from downtown, and a lot of them are kind of ending up in the neighborhood that we're in. So, you know, the city's kind of in flux, and this is a really important time. I think it's a good time for this kind of institution building or Indigenous hub building, because you know, a lot of the Indigenous residents of the city are feeling a little bit disenfranchised at the moment. Next, please. The site that we're building on it was most recently occupied by an elementary school that was part of the Catholic school system. So the site totals about 4 acres. There's an existing kind of 2-story school that fits on the site. One of the adjacent uses, you can kind of see it here. There's an urban farm, an allotment garden that's been formed by the city that right now runs along the right side of the triangle. And you know, so we've got these interesting kind of community partners that we're kind of working with. Next, please. This is a shot of the school that's there now. I mean, it's not in my nature to tear things down, but with this school, given, you know, it wasn't really designed with accessibility in mind. It wasn't designed with directionality in mind. It's got some contamination issues that, you know, we're dealing with. So I'm not feeling too bad about a master plan that would see this place come down. But that's a shot of it there. Circa probably about 1960, 1950, in that range. Next, please. I spoke a little bit about our neighbor, and I'm really, really enthused about these guys, the McQuiston Urban Farm. You can see some of the produce that is being propagated by these guys. Very, very energetic, you know, really, really popular. Next, please. But they're typical, you know, they're acting like a, you know, a typical kind of allotment garden where, you know, each family that wants to participate gets this raised bed plot. And it's been operating for a few years now. It continues to grow. They've done some work to start some orchards kind of in the southern part of the urban farm. So we really see these guys as an asset. Next, please. This is the plan that we've came up with, and you can see it's got the arc kind of at the top of the circle, and that's where we've got the housing component placed right now. We're looking at introducing a new intersection at the top of the site, so that, you know, that's and there's also an idea about extending the bus system into the site as well, with a bus stop that would kind of be, you know, in that cul-de-sac that you see. The lobe in pink that's on the lower left-hand side is where Nawasa would go, where they would deliver their childcare service and some of their community outreach work that they do. And then the blue piece on the lower on the lower right-hand side, that's where we've got in 2 or 3 stories space to deliver services for both Dedwada Desni and McMaster Family Health in tandem there. And so we set this thing up so that each of these lobes could kind of be built sort of at different times. You know, we're thinking that the housing piece will probably go first, but the reality is these different service providers, they get their funding from different branches of the provincial and federal governments. So we tried to set it up so that each of the lobes could be constructed in a phased approach. We weren't sure which one was going to be first, but each can kind of proceed as funding gets secured, and so that over time, the master plan for the site can kind of be envisioned. Next slide, please. This is kind of what it looks like. So what we're planning on doing is we really want to take the urban farm, which is right now this very kind of orthogonal kind of Eurocentric sort of layout for gardening, and we really want to make it a part of the actual building and landscape. So this thing will be about promoting biodiversity. It'll be about food production and food sovereignty. You know, there's also an idea about trying to catch rain on the roof and through gravity have it water some of the plants. Next slide, please. This is looking at it from the, we're viewing it from the south side now. So you're looking at the housing piece, which is, you know, multi-story. It will have some affordable units in it. Very, very strong kind of directionality to the south. We've got these cascading roof terraces, again, that are going to become part of the curriculum, part of food production. You know, so for us, it's been very much about digging in, about piling up, so that there's kind of this almost like equilibrium between where you dig and where you fill, and seeing that soil that gets produced, and not thinking about shipping it off site, but, you know, how can we use that? How can we incorporate it into the design solution so that it provides support, and that it creates these different microclimates that we can kind of use to our advantage. Next, please. And, you know, we've done a lot of climatic analysis on this. So we've taken a look at, you know, the impact of different slopes. We've taken a look at how the microclimate gets influenced by seasonality and the direction of the prevailing wind. Next, please. Here's some shots that show kind of how those conditions change, you know, sort of throughout the months. I'm not going to get too much into the science of this, except to say, for the next slide, we're really taking a look at how specific plant species can be planted in certain areas based on the microclimate that we're going to be producing. So there's an idea, there's a connection between the architecture, the quality of the soil, you know, directionality. How can they all work together to sort of optimize food production and really make sort of a kind of a stronger kind of you know, benefit the community, you know, in the most optimum way that it can, by working with natural forces as opposed to trying to control them in any way. Next, please. And here's just an idea of, you know, we've started this. We're going to be working in close conjunction with the urban farm to work with them to really kind of fine tune these systems. You know, I think, you know, as we learn more with them, there'll be an idea about making some minor changes from year to year to really optimize our situation. And, you know, and as the trees grow around us, we'll be having to make some modifications there. I'm just about done. Next slide, please. This is sort of a shot of the center space that we've created, which we think is going to be like a fantastic place for an urban powwow, large gatherings, very strong orientation to the south. You enter through the eastern direction, which is a central idea to our culture. Next, please. And then lastly, you know, we were also thinking about what it would look like, you know, at night. We've got some stars in this rendering here, so modeling it at different times of the day. And I think I've got one more, just an overview slide, my last one. So that's really what I wanted to talk about today. I think it really sort of illustrates kind of like where we're at in the office, how we're starting to think about some of our development sites, and really about trying to kind of incorporate an Indigenous viewpoint sort of from the very outset to the benefit of our clients. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Brian. What an incredible project that you just shared. It made me super excited. It pretty much touched on every point that I try to include in my class with respect to form and the natural environment, and how to really consider everything, all our relations when building these types of sites. So I thought as you shared all that, I'm like, oh, they're gonna need seeds, but I guess you're working with a group. But I do have some of my seeds here, and happy to share for when that time comes. Thank you so much. That was really remarkable in terms of a project for the future, building off knowledge of the past, miigwech. And I think now we will pass it over to Tiffany. Tiffany, if you're ready, can't wait to hear your sharing before our moderated session, miigwech.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Brian, for your presentation. That was really, I mean, it's just lots of good content there. So I'll just get it right into my presentation, and then, like you said, we can have a good discussion. So again, thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate your time. My name is Tiffany Shaw. My family is from Fort McMurray, although I was born in Calgary and raised in Edmonton, like we already introduced. My practice really revolves around the idea of curation art, public art, and architecture. I sort of slip between all of those worlds throughout the day, but it's really sort of bannered by motherhood and family. This is where a lot of my inspiration comes from. So this is just an image of my family. I'm in the lap of my great-grandmother, with my grandmother on my left and my mom and my brother on my right. And a lot of the work that I work through is around them mostly, but now also my children and my nieces and nephews. This is one of those examples. Some of these works were in the Architecture by Venice Biennale in 2012, so a little bit of a while ago. But this is around the combination of past, present, future. And these items were sort of foraged or brought from certain areas that were really important to me. So the leather cabin is from Fort McMurray. It was some deer hide that my grandmother sent me. And the birch bark is foraged near this area that has been used for time immemorial in Edmonton. And I'm trying to show the dovetail-like joint along the corner of there, which is a Métis craft or trades that Métis had used the dovetail-like joint during the fort era predominantly when they're building the houses or the forts. And then the bottom right is beading pattern by my great-grandmother. She was a moccasin maker. And so I put this on like a mirror vinyl. And I was really thinking about, we talked about care, but there was also this byline about the land. And so I deal with a lot of reflection in my work. I won't always show it here, but this idea about reflecting your own indigeneity, but also reflecting your own environment is something that I'm very much interested in. So this is a piece in Edmonton. So this is the North Saskatchewan here. And this is there's 5 artworks in this park, and I'm just one of them. This is called Paranthahan. And I have a little bit of a video because I think the video actually talks a bit better about it. Can you hear the audio? Okay,
I really want to pay honor to the process that was created by the Edmonton Arts Council with curator Candace Hopkins about this idea of gathering around this place. And there were lots of stories that talk about the people that came through this area and continue to come through this area. And I wanted to really make a mark of that specifically. And so what I've done is I've created amphitheater style seating, 4 steps, and then it is connected to a sacred circle at the base. And so for me, it's really about Métis culture coming together with the European seating and the sacred circle stemming from Indigenous people. And the 4 steps all relate to different periods of time. So the top step is related to prehistoric time. The 3rd step, it is really to mark the fort era. So it has wood on the surface, and it's to really remind you of the forts, but also Métis cabins. And so at the corner is a dovetail-like joint, which is Métis specific. And the 3rd step, it's related to our contemporary time. So I have water jet cut a beading pattern by my great-grandmother, as she was a moccasin maker, out of this Corten steel. And the 4th step, which is the last step at the bottom, it's about our future condition. And I'm really interested in where are Indigenous people going today and tomorrow? What materials are we using? And so it is a polished mirror steel. So it's reflecting yourself and also reflecting your environment, which is the park itself. When you're sitting or standing at the tallest step, you have the greatest view. You actually have this vista into the downtown Edmonton core, and you have this beautiful river valley in front of you. And I think that's where you have the greatest perspective. But when you're sitting down at the closest step, which is the future condition, you sort of have the most limited view, so you can really only see too far into the future. And so for me, it's not only just about how you think or do, it's really about your kind of vista and how far you're really able to see. So even though you're far back in history, you can see the perspective, but you can't have the voice. And when you're in the future, you have the voice, but you don't have the vista.
Thank you for listening to that little video. It's just nicer. The music and the narration sounds a little bit easier to kind of have it condensed that way. But I just realized it's just a rehashing what I just talked about the cabins, but I think in this way you can see how I scale it up a little bit in terms of reflection and that dovetail like joint and texture. But the corner is something that I also really try to pay attention to in my projects, because I think this is where the architectural discourse really comes together, because we're always asking, how do we turn the corner? So I was very specific about turning the corner differently for each of these 4 steps. This was also during the time that I had my son, my first child, Jasper, and this was my first public art piece that was permanent. So I think it was a really great learning curve for myself to see how these details can come together, because while I was in my internship as an architect, I still wasn't really part of the construction administration process, knowing how these details come together. So it was really great learnings, and I loved the process. This is in Winnipeg at the Markham bus station. It's close to Louis Riel's home. And this project was supposed to be around the idea of Métis land rights. Originally, I thought if we're going to talk about Métis land rights, we should talk about script, because it's not a well-known history. But for Métis people, this can be a really difficult conversation because people think it's a lot about fraud. This is where the government was trying to extinguish our Aboriginal title. And for First Nations people, treaty was signed. So they were dealt with in terms of a group, and Métis people were dealt with individually. And there's lots of mixing around there. That's just like the more I know about script, the less I know. So if you know more about it, you can email me at a time. It's a good conversation. But First Nations and Métis people sometimes would, so a Métis person sometimes would go into treaty, and sometimes First Nation people will go into script at that time because they wanted parcels of land or $80, for example, versus staying in treaty. So there's a bit of mixing back there. But what I had learned about script was that while there is this dark past about how difficult it is to get script in the first place, there is also a lineage that we can follow that's written and recorded. So it shows how our family lineage stems back, further back. And so there is some benefits to that process. I have my great-grandfather's script in this project as well. Or no, my great-great-great-grandfather, or my great-great, 2 greats or 3 greats, it's one of those ones. And the family name is Louis Trajo, that's his name. And so I asked to put the script on the glass, and I worked on this project with Frank Tuff from the University of Alberta. He is not Métis, but he runs the MAP program, the Métis Archival Project Lab. And they were already having all these scans. They went to Ottawa, took all these scans of script, and so we worked together to put them in place. I did a public art call across Canada asking people for their own script. So sometimes this was supplied, or sometimes they give me a name, and then I'd find better reproductions and then send it to them. And there's just a whole host of documents. People are most commonly used to this image of script, but this is actually a coupon, and script is the application process. There's a little bit of an image here, and it is meant to basically be impossible to get these documents. So, or this piece of land or this money. It's usually because you had to travel far distances to get it. They did it over about 11 years for you to sort of fulfill this duty as they went out from east to west to survey the land. And you couldn't get it until they surveyed it. So you could have the script, but if they didn't survey the land, you didn't get your land. Or if you traveled, it cost about the same amount to it costs like $80 to travel there. And then once you get the coupon, you get $80. So it's sort of like cost neutral. This image here that I'm circling with my mouse is one person's journey to get script. This is how many pieces of documentation they had to get in order to do it. So just as like years. And you had to speak English and write English too. So that's part of the process as well. So Frank Tuff let me do that project, not that he let me, but he said, actually, if you're going to talk about land rights, you really need to talk about use and occupancy. And so he showed me this image, the seasonal activities of the Red River Métis circa 1870. And he says, this is how you discuss how to claim land. And so it shows the Red River area where you can see the English and the French occupations along the Red River lots, or the river lots. And then it shows where we go for berry picking or for duck hunting or for fishing, for sugaring. Then it also shows the Red River trail carts, which is really critical. So on the left is exploration. So there's two pieces. One is a script on the bus shelters, and then there's this piece of, I call them the markers here. So you can see the same markings of where they would go for the Red River cart trails. The pink is the settlements. And then you can see different dashes. That's like where you can find the sugaring, for example. And then each of these markers, I call them, are certain posts. So there's Upper Fort Garry, Lower Fort Garry, Lanes Post, Portage La Prairie, and then I also have Pembina Post. And I looked up information on each one of them. The base of them are as a steel and has the date that they were created, the forts themselves. This is Upper Fort Garry and Lower Fort Garry. They have the most information. So this is the Red River, the Assiniboine River. This is where the provincial government was founded with Louis Riel in this place. And then this is the stone that is the walls of the fort versus the Upper Fort Garry, where this is Lower Fort Garry. This is Upper Fort Garry. I always kind of get them mixed up. And I was looking at the wood. So I'm always looking at what are these things constructed of? And if I couldn't find images, I leaned on other information around the post. So Upper Fort Garry, Lower Fort Garry had the most information around their structure because they're still existing today. And so you can see the differences between the walls, and they also had wood in this fort. And I'm looking at the dovetail-like joint again here, except I'm shearing it, I'm coring it with a circle. So I'm looking at this different way to translate the dovetail-like joint around a surface. And then this is also where Treaty 1 was signed, which is of course, you know, First Nation specific history, but we're all a treaty people, I believe, and this is important context. This marker here, I had the least amount of information, so I made it about the future. So there's the reflection, as you see, which is reflecting the environment. But then there's a steel piece where you can use your finger to move the piece, and your hands and the oils get embedded, and it changes over time. Because I'm always thinking, how can we interact with people, or mostly specifically children, so that they know that they're there and that they're important. And this is the Red River Cart Trail. This is another one. This is down south. This is heavily around the Red River Cart Trails as well. And you can see how they're sort of slightly curved. And this is showing again the geometry of the Red River carts. So it's actually like a disc. And so I was trying to get that disc into this curve geometry. So it was just a really fun project. This is Métis Crossing. I'm just going to run out of time. We'll go over this really quickly. This is a project at my office, Reimagine. We've been working with Métis Crossing for over 20 years. And they have a site just northeast of Edmonton, about an hour and a half near Smoky Lake. And this project, we do quite a bit with them. This is the gathering center that we've done, but we're doing a hotel and we're doing a master plan with them right now. This is sort of the large vestibule that you'll see on the south side. And I believe that this really relates to land because it operates basically like a large vestibule where you can have, it can be a few degrees cooler or warmer on this area, however you need it based on the weather and the environment. And I think this allows for land-based activities to happen more easily, which is a tenet for Indigenous people. And so this is a really interesting project to see how well this performs over the time of the seasons. And we're also indexing, there's historical cabins on this site as well. This is the Métis Crossing. Oh, my timer says I'm done because I went 14 minutes, so I have one more minute. And so we're just trying to index some of the historical river lots that are on this site. This is what is unique about Métis Crossing, is it's a major stakeholder is Métis Nation of Alberta. It's not a settlement. but it has river lots here, and lots of Métis families lived here. So this is one of the cabins that was here, and so we're detailing them, say at the base of the fireplace, for example. Here's the hotel that we're currently building. It should be open in a month or so. And this is the south view of it, and it's directly connected to the crossing. So we're trying to use similar details when doing that. And it also has a water treatment room here. This is why I put it, because it relates to land, because we're really exploring how to treat water, how to treat it when it comes from the well, which is what they're going to be using soon rather than trucking water in and out, and then how to treat the wastewater. So it's been a wonderful exercise. They also have a wildlife park coming in, or they have it now currently. They opened it this summer, where they have bison, they have prairie bison, and they also have white bison, which is sacred for us. And they also have elk and horses. And so it's this really interesting place around education and tourism, where you can go and learn about Métis people thrive in the past and the future. So they're a fun project. So I have more slides, but I stopped because I thought I would run out of time. So that was good planning. So I'll stop right there.
Tiffany, amazing work that you're involved in, incredible forums. When I see those forums, I think about how every person who approaches those spaces or enters those spaces might feel. And I feel that you have been inspired through culture, through your education, to consider all those, many of those layers of teachings that go along with our knowledge as Indigenous peoples. And I thank you for that. It's inspiring, similarly to the work of Brian. Thank you both for what I feel is so necessary at this time, which is to embody our teachings and apply it to our work, something that I try to inspire in my students, recognizing what's within their heart. And that really brings for me a first question. I have a lot of things to say, but I know I really want to make it about you both. The question that really arose for me throughout both of your presentations was your inspiration. And I think I would say culturally, maybe the people, if there's elders, or perhaps it's the land, perhaps it's the teachings that you've dreamt. But I'm curious to know from you both, what would you say is one of your, or maybe two of your greatest inspirations that fueled the fire within you? Maybe starting with Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I'm old enough that my early architecture studies, they predate the internet, right? So if I wanted to, look up Indigenous architecture, it wasn't like you could type it into Google, and get an answer. So I wasn't really aware of Douglas Cardinal or some of the other, famous architects that are out there. I think my inspiration really sort of came from coming from a community where I had a chance to, participate in construction projects. I used to do a lot of things with my father and my uncles. They had kind of like this pecking order, right, where Joe was the oldest, and then David and Albert and Roger. So ideas would kind of go, kind of like up and down between those guys, and always very, very a lot of fun to work with. Of course, my opinion didn't count for anything. Even after I graduated, I was the junior on the team, but just being around those guys and not not being afraid at all to try anything. I think that's probably where the biggest inspiration came from, just being in a community where I was encouraged to make things.
Thank you, Brian and Tiffany.
Yes, actually, well, actually, unlike Brian, I was aware of Douglas Cardinal, but that was because my mom took me to see his building when I was like 5. So I'll just show a quick image of which one that is specifically, because I think that will help. Oh, where'd it go? Hold on. So St. Albert Place in St. Albert. And this was, for me, a moment because I hadn't really seen anything like it before. So this is that St. Albert Place here. This is from another project I was on. And I hadn't really seen anything like that in the area. And my mom said that he was actually our cousin because the Cardinals adopted my great-grandmother. And I don't think that we're actually related, but I think it was really a wonderful thing to grow up believing that architecture was in my family, even though it is so incredibly rare to know about Indigenous architects in the first place. And so that was something I felt that I could create environments that were greater than myself. I had always that feeling of, I didn't go into architecture right away, but when I finally got there after my fine arts degree, it made a lot of sense to me. It had all come together. But mostly when I'm creating spaces now, it's not only to create spaces that are greater than myself, but to also sort of make people feel joy or to relieve the stress or the trauma that they might be experiencing. So often with my public art projects, for example, I'm often thinking about my brother who, he says he's not homeless, but sometimes I don't know where he is. And sometimes I don't think he has a home, even though he is very adamant that he does. And I want to create spaces for him that make him feel like that he should be there, that he belongs to be there. And that's mostly my drive for public art and for architecture. It's to create more spaces for my family in general, to remove the barriers and to have visibility. Because in Fort McMurray, when I would go visit my family, that we'd go to the hospital sometimes because sometimes they were sick, and there was no way to make them feel like themselves in that space. There was no indication of any Indigenous life in the hallways. There was just one medicine wheel before you go up in the elevator, and that is it. And I just wanted spaces more to reflect our family.
Right on. It's amazing to see you both be inspired by your families and the connections. And similarly, I'm inspired by my family in a way that wanting to sort of step beyond the capacity that they had. I'm mixed ancestry, but having those challenges within Indigenous family, I think that we all face, but wanting to sort of step beyond that and step outside of that trauma and into, offering something from the heart to the land or to the students that can go beyond where they had the capacity to go. And Brian, I was really amazed by the work that you're doing. I took out this little piece. This was built by Craig Crane. He's an architect, and we worked closely together. It's a modular build. It's actually a similar, I would say, form style. And what's interesting, for the longest time, it had on it a little piece of jasper. So I felt like, wow, those things came together tonight. And I guess my next question for you both, it has to do with where we're at right now. You both talked about being inspired by the past and also looking to the future, but creating something in the present that can really inspire change in individuals. It's sort of a two-pronged question. What do you say, or what can you say to Indigenous peoples, given that you both have achieved, a level of success that I think allows Indigenous peoples who look at you both to say, hey, I want to be like that. I want to be inspired by that work. But what do you say to those individuals who may be on the cusp of of achieving some level of greatness as one part of the question. And then the other part would be just through the work at the University of Waterloo School of Architecture, from my own experience, there's so many students who have, what I've seen, been inspired by Indigenous knowledge. And we have these moments, I have these moments to share these little bits and to see how they, as you know, non-Indigenous peoples, so to speak, are want to take action. What do you say to those who may also be on the cusp in that sense and not really knowing how to help? Because I'm sure both of you have been, well, you mentioned it, but been supported by not just Indigenous peoples, but by non-Indigenous peoples as well. So what do you say to the Indigenous students, the young people who are saying, hey, I want to grow, I want to be successful in whatever it is that they decide, and also to the, you know, the non-Indigenous peoples? I think we're all Indigenous, but you know, those students who say, hey, that's inspiring, that Indigenous related work is inspiring, but how do I take that step? Start with Brian.
Yeah, I kind of think some of it's happening already. Like, you know, for a couple of hundred years, we didn't really have any say in what our institutions look like. You know, that opportunity to kind of participate was taken away, and you know, and now we're getting it back. We're becoming more and more involved. And you know, like before 1961, if you wanted to be an architect, you had to enfranchise into Canadian excuse me, into Canadian society, right? And I mean, who was going to do that? But I think now, like every year when I take a look at, you know, the students that are graduating, whether it's University of Manitoba, you know, all of the different schools, you know, I'm seeing 4 or 5 Indigenous youth, you know, they're coming into the profession. So I think it's kind of happening naturally. The other thing that I'm kind of thankful for, that, you know, as the architecture profession in Canada has gained more confidence in itself and has developed some level of maturity, you know, I see it's starting to kind of cut its coat strings from its European precedents, and it's starting to develop its own language now, that it's more about sustainability, biodiversity. You know, we're seeing things like net zero, LEED criteria being ingrained. We're starting to see projects being developed by multidisciplinary consortiums where the landscape architect has a seat beside the civil engineer, who has a seat beside the arborist, who has a seat beside the architect. And this is the way that we traditionally worked. So I think kind of like the mainstream view is coming closer and closer to the Indigenous worldview that we've had for like 30,000 years. So, you know, and I think you're also starting to see that a little bit if you take a look at the Pritzker Prize winners now for the last 5 years or so, which is really like the Nobel Peace Prize for architects, right? You're starting to see firms being recognized for doing Indigenous, grassroots kind of sustainable projects, and a less emphasis on these architects that kind of, you know, parachute themselves into a community with a preconceived vision, and, you know, producing something that's as foreign to Toronto as like the ROM edition, or, you know, some of these projects, or like, you know, the Sharp Center at OCAD University with the floating tabletop. Like we're not seeing that as much. So I think it's just coming through a natural kind of maturity, which I'm kind of thankful for.
Same here. Yeah, and I'm very thankful that I think, you know, our knowledge has always been here. The energy of our knowledge, that sustainability, that way, that matriarchy, which you mentioned, you know, but allowing the energy of the woman to come through. And certainly speak about that, and we're still coming up against, that glass square structure that seems to, I don't know where the inspiration came for that. Perhaps not a good place. Yeah, I totally hear what you're saying. I think it's coming out of the land. It's coming out of natural. And if we just be vessels for that to continue to fulfill its place, all we have to do is just listen, and we can act based on what we hear from our mother. Thank you, Brian, for that. And Tiffany.
Thank you for that. Yeah, Brian, I always leave with that I'd say it was illegal to be an architect, but I think you're right about enfranchising. I think illegal is just a bit more of a stronger word to be an architect if you're an Indigenous. But from 1961, which talks about why there are so few of us, but also, I always think about what are the barriers to being a student today, more than how to keep encouraging youth. So I really like your question, because people often ask me what are the barriers instead. So you turned it around. And I, like Brian, also agree. I think it is already happening, because even when I went to school, which now I'm starting to realize that I am much older, but it wasn't really discussed at all in school at any time, and it wasn't safe to do. Whereas now there's these centers being built, Indigenous knowledge and wisdom centers, and these little hubs, and funding is directly added. And when you're able to write your letters, there's an understanding of why you're writing a letter. And I think that there's still a long way to go, but just that universities are actually taking steps to provide space is good. Is it always authentic? I'm not sure. Is it, but I think it's more good than harm. And I think for students to trust themselves is the thing that they should be doing, because as long as you trust yourself, that will come through. But that's really for any student. And I think being a student is hard to do, because there is no, like Brian and I, we can do community engagement. We get lots of things to push and pull us on a project, whether it's our consultants that we're working with, or the community and the community themselves. We're never really alone. But when you're a student, you're actually just making it by yourself and then presenting against each other. It's not against, but it really does feel like it sometimes, I think, in some environments, like who's got the better project. And I think people can forget that they're actually not alone in the room. Like, they have their family, or if they feel like they're removed from the culture, which can be for some people, there are ways to just be quiet with yourself and think about what the land is trying to tell you, rather than what you think you're missing. And I think those are the things that you should try and reach towards when you're feeling alone, which is a typical student experience. But it's same with non-Indigenous students, because I find appropriation in the architectural, I find in architecture schools, non-Indigenous students don't know how to access Indigenous knowledge, because they have to work on these projects, but they don't know where to come from. But I would like to remind them that they also have their own family lineage that they can think about to how it can bridge together. So it's like, you don't have to appropriate. You can also think about your own family, how to come to that. It's got to be like a together, not a separation. And I find this is a very big problem with Indigenous projects in general. Indigenous or not, who's the student?
Yeah, I totally see your perspective, and the realization that we still represent such a small fraction of the population. And then when it comes to education, that colonial education that we almost is a requirement in order to participate in this iteration of civilization, it further reduces our numbers. And so we're asked to do so much. And for me, I really want more people to be inspired by their lineage, wherever that is. And I think as far as I've learned from my culture, Anishinaabe culture, And I've also had many awesome Haudenosaunee teachers and Métis teachers. There's a unity that we seek first. Like, it's not about division, you're this, I'm this. It's about, I'm this, what are you? And how does that manifest? And I've seen that with some of the students that I've taught through Waterloo School of Architecture, through the course, being like, hey, I have a culture, and how does this take shape? Both of your work, and I have a big bias here, but both of your work, it makes me feel hopeful for the future. It makes me feel that I think sometimes we work oftentimes in isolation wherever we are around this country, and because we're so focused on the work that we have to do, which is a lot, and sometimes it's double the work of a normal faculty or in other faculties. It's sometimes we're consumed by it. I certainly am, but I think what I see is that when we are inclusive of Indigenous knowledge, when we are inspired by Indigenous knowledge, it makes space, whatever that might be, better, especially if it's inspired by the teachings of our ancestors. And both of you have certainly established that, and thank you. It really is. It makes me hopeful. And I was like, when I looked up your work, I'm like, whoa, man, these guys are awesome. And I think everyone can agree. And also, at one point there was 95 people in the room, maybe a few more than that. And there's interest here. There's people who are saying, hey, I want to be part of this movement. So we are gonna open this up to questions from the audience. I just want to encourage audience members that if you have a question for Tiffany or Brian, to be specific in your question, so we don't have too much time left, but it would be great to hear audience reaction. And yeah, I'm super honored to be part of tonight. And I hope to get to meet you both sometime in the future. Yeah, because you've inspired me tonight, so thank you. And I see a question here. How can humans, and specifically architects, pay attention to timescales that are seemingly invisible? From the poetry of a leaf tumbling from a tree to the expanse of time it takes for the mountains to form, do you think this deep relationship with the land is in tension with the architecture profession that operates on the timescales of deadlines, or do you choose what to pay attention to? It can be either of you or both of you. Would somebody like to try to answer that one? Very poetic question.
You want to go first, Tiffany? No?
I think she's coming to you.
Like I know personally, like one of the people that I'm kind of influenced by is excuse me, Elder Duke Redbird. He has this writing that talks about the food forest, and what he's done is he's taken the canopy of a forest from like the very treetops to the underworld where you get into the roots, and he's associated each of the levels in a canopy with one of the 7 grandparent teachings. And so he talks about, at the top of the trees, you kind of have this vista, and it symbolizes truth. And to harvest a potato, you kind of have to get down on your knees, get into the roots and dig it up, and it represents humility. So he's gone through, and you got the vines that kind of grow up through the ground and wrap themselves around everything, and those represent love. So for me, that's kind of like I take a lot of inspiration from that metaphor, where I think nature can become a real strong part of the curriculum any project that gets constructed, right? Like if we can find ways so that, you know, the changing of the seasons, you know, the 13 moon cycles, if they can have some physical impact on the way that a space or a building is perceived, you know, I think it starts to make, you know, some of those connections. And, you know, I really think that people are kind of really striving for that. You know, they want to be connected to nature. They want to learn from it. They want to appreciate it. They want to feel a connectedness to kind of like everything that's around them. And, you know, they want to have access to natural light. They want to have access to natural ventilation. You know, so for me, these are all things that, you know, kind of talk a little bit. I don't think I answered the question fully, but maybe it's the beginning of an answer. So
Yeah, I would say it's like the inspiration. The time scales are inspiration, and it's great to use these abstract ideas as drivers for projects. So like the Peihanan, who I showed the amphitheater style seating, I use quartzite from the riverbed local to the area, but then I embedded stone from rocks I collected from the Bay of Fundy that summer, because my family comes from there as well, my Acadian side of my family. And it was really not that my great grandfather, who is Acadian, was Indigenous, but it was really to point out how Indigenous people travel all over this continent, and they will find different stones or minerals in different places that don't belong where they are, just to show how much we've really traveled. And I think that is something that we still do today. So it's like how to pull from the past, but then make it still relevant. And then also how to, one thing I really like is about how to misuse materials. So when the metal would come around the barrels from Europe to what is now called Canada, the First Nations people would melt down the metal rings around the barrels for arrowhead points, for example. And those would be for different reasons. When they had the stone, and a point would hit the bone, it would break off. But when the metal would hit the bone, it would bend, and you could just like kind of bend it back and then reuse it very quickly. But they both have different properties. Like the stone will last longer if the point doesn't get broken, or it takes longer to shape it back into a point, but it has a longevity. But you can do more arrows, more points with the metal. So like, it's really about how you can use materials and thinking about their properties is how I really think about the time scale shifting as a narrative to drive it.
Thank you both. Those are awesome answers. I often talk about how in the contemporary time do we use our traditional knowledge to apply, you know, these principles to our work. And I think that really depends on the individual and their teachings. But thank you both for those great answers. What kind of narratives could be applied to preserving and or redeveloping problematic architectural heritage in order to properly represent histories that have been distorted or repressed? And I think this will probably be the last question, just because of the time frame. But thank you, Frank, for asking that. Is there either of you want to try to answer that one? It's in the chat box.
Well, I think for me, a lot of times when we pick up a request for proposal and they talk about, you know, the requirement for community engagement, you know, a lot of firms see that as, you know, this box that you kind of have to check, right? But I see it as more, you know, you want to go into each community and you want to listen to their individual stories, because a lot of times, excuse me, the stories really convey the culture, and they have, you know, very, very deep meaning, and they can change from one community to the next, even if those communities are located, you know, just a few miles apart. They all have their legends, their parables that really are the vessels that hold our culture. And I think by making sure you give yourself the time to listen to those stories, you're really, it's such a privilege whenever we get a chance to do that, to sit in a relaxed atmosphere, take the time, listen to the elders talk about these things, because there are always these underlying, messages about, fairness and equity, about, excuse me, let's see if I get a drink here, about lack of hierarchy, about, the equality of the sexes and the rightful place of animals. Like these lessons are all kind of ingrained in the stories. So I think if there was a way to kind of preserve or redevelop problematic areas, like go into the communities and just listen for an extended period of time and soak in as much as you can.
Yes, I totally agree with that. It's because if you don't listen to the community, then you're not actually facing the reality of what's there. And if you don't listen to the community, then you don't know what to do, really. It's otherwise you're just operating in a vacuum. I also think that it's a good time to switch strategies. Just because one way was done, it could be a new way, such as level of governance or circle. So a lot of Indigenous people believe around the idea of circle governance, where everyone has a vote. I am part of an Indigenous collective called Otitsewan Contemporary Art Collective, which Andrew thoughtfully mentioned. And we all sort of base our decision on consensus making. It's a slower process, but it allows for a way for people to come to the table on their own rather than forcing them. And if one person doesn't agree, we just don't move forward with the decision. So that means that we're moving forward together as a group. And a lot of people have a lot of hesitation to open that up, to give people a voice. I see it so many times where people actually want you to make it a box engagement, or they call it, what's the government word? I just really dislike that word, where the government always just says you have to do this one word where you go in and extract information and leave. And there's no capacity for relationship building. So it's really important to make sure that people have a voice and are heard, because only then can healing occur. It's really not about reconciliation, but conciliation, where people can understand the information being presented in front of them. If you don't give them the space to voice it, then it won't come up, and then you're not actually really dealing with it.
Definitely. Brian, I'm not sure if you're related to Tom Porter, distantly.
Fifth cousin.
Okay, twice removed. Just kidding. I thought we were very serious in these forums, but I feel like it's so important to laugh as well, and to remind people of how important when those relationships are formed, that one of the ways that we deal with the trauma of the past or the problematic architecture. I was reminded the other day in a presentation of problematic histories, literature, that they seem to continue to crop up. And as much as from our perspective, we're like, how could you possibly keep that narrative going? It's still going. And on a serious note, I think sometimes all of us have to really question why is that, and what is really the force behind that. But I brought up Tom because he is one of the people who I have sat with and listened to, and actually in his home there in Fonda, New York, in the beautiful homelands of the Mohawk Nation. And those moments are the ones that you never forget. And there's, like you say, there's that underlying message that rests there. And if you really are able to read between the lines, to listen rather than to your own interpretation in your head, but what resonates through the heart, I think what results from that is exactly what you both have achieved so far. and so thankful for that. It's clear you both have been inspired by our ancestral knowledge, and undoubtedly will continue to develop your work through that narrative, through that story that has been shared since time immemorial. And I think all of us have to thank you for that. It's a little strange, like, you know, me, if I was there, I'd be like standing up and clapping and everything. But what I would like to say, yeah, it is just, you know, thank you for your time today. Thank you for being people who can share knowledge, not just verbally, but on the land, in for architecture, in spaces like bus stops that people sit there and stand there. And I really love that work, Tiffany, that people can be in those spaces and feel the presence of that love that I see. I can feel it in your work just by looking at what you have achieved there. And the same for you, Brian. Everything that you touched on is like, wow, like somebody's doing the work. And I think some of my students who have taken the course can be like, it's not just me saying this. Somebody has interpreted the literature, somebody has heard the stories, and now is applying it in a beautiful work in Hamilton, which is so close. I can't wait to visit that site and see it come to be, and bring seeds there. Like I that is my commitment to. That's what came right away. It's like I have to bring the seeds, or even share some of the seed keepers that are part of your nation that I've worked with and have learned from, who have held on to those seeds for the 30,000 years that you mentioned, and have changed them. So thank you guys so much. Thank you both so much. I do want to mention that the next speaker in the speaker series is there's two, Ronaldo Wolcott and Thandi Lowenson, and their next talk is Abolishing Property as Architectural Care, October 28th at 6 p.m. It will be moderated by Ellen Denelson, and supporting through the Distinguished International Visiting Scholar Program. I think that's everybody should, there you go, there's the registration that Julie has provided. Thank you, Julie. I will be registering for that myself. And I believe that's all for today. If there's anybody else who has some final words, I'm always open to that. And thank you for allowing me to share and learn from you both today, Miigwech.
Oh, Andrew, I just really wanted to thank you for your heart and for your respect in this conversation. I really felt it, and so really appreciate sharing this space with you and with Brian. And thanks so much to the organizers. Really appreciate it.
No.
Yeah, thank you. I really hope the next conversation's around a kitchen table someplace with a cup of tea. That'd be awesome.
Not spilled tea.
Yeah, don't spill it this time.
Right on. So in my language, we don't say goodbye. Of course, we say we'll see you again. And what I always say, Gigawabmin Minawa, which is I'll see you again. And what I'd like to add is in this life or the next. Miigwech to you all for your time. Gigawabmin Minwa.